By the mid 1870s, the majority of white Southern voters were now regaining in suffrage. So there were several different things that, for their cause, needed to happen if Democrats in the South were able to retake power. Um, Republicans had made strong movements from the Civil War era on, all throughout Reconstruction. The South openly fought against that. So, for states that had larger white populations, regaining control by democratic process would be pretty easy for Democrats. In states where you had larger black populations, that would be a lot more challenging. So, various different social movements would be organized to prevent black people from voting, black men rather. Okay. In an effort to disenfranchise black men, organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan were put together to keep black people from being able to vote. They would prevent them from organizing in any different ways. They would terrorize them and often even kill black people. Black people. Um, you have various different white males in these organizations who openly prevented black people from representing themselves. And since they largely voted Republican, the Ku Klux Klan was organized to prevent black people from voting for Republicans. And the Klan and other organizations would often bully white males into voting Democrat. Okay? So they would police many different elections by arming themselves and intimidating black voters or voters, white voters who intended to vote Republican. And by a process of disenfranchisement, they would gain clout. To this day, the Klan still is in operation. They look quite a bit different than they did from the Reconstruction era, but they still exist. I don't know how, but they're still in existence. And they have expanded their views not just unto black people, but also unto Jews, Catholics, Hispanics, uh, Muslims, all kinds of different stuff. Okay? So the Klan's promise, if you will, their purpose, is to disenfranchise those who disagree with them for various different reasons that you should probably see as being obvious. Okay. Um, Not only that, there were other pressures that white society would levy onto black people around that time. So, yeah, black people are free, but doesn't mean that a white planter has to hire them or sell to them or extend credit or anything else of the sort. There are various different ways that you can refuse to work with black Republicans. Okay? So, you might refuse to pay them fairly, if at all, or maybe kind of skirt various different laws and working with black codes. You can kind of circumvent some of these new laws and amendments that are meant to protect former slaves. So, there are various different things that were enacted by Republicans in Congress to prevent organizations like the Klan from discriminating against voters based upon race, so as to prevent the idea of disenfranchisement and other forms of social intimidation. So, um, federal troops under the Enforcement Acts could be called into an area so as to enforce various different laws that would prevent discrimination. Okay. Um, by the mid 1870s, Klan violence would generally kind of wane a little bit, but they were still around. And in pockets, they exist in the country to this day. So they're still around. There were other different organizations who had similar rationale for keeping black people from voting. But the Klan is the most notable. Okay, so otherwise, though, the North was having some of its own political issues to where many different abolitionists and others who had formerly been radical from a Reconstruction standpoint, they saw the 14th and 15th Amendments as kind of being the completion of their cause. They didn't want to further continue to reform. And they had kind of convinced themselves that the 15th Amendment, allowing black people now to vote, or black men to vote, would kind of solve ills. Now that black men have a voice, they can kind of fend for themselves. They can take care of themselves. So you have a lot of these former radicals within the Republican Party who would kind of rebrand themselves and kind of disengage from any sort of misgovernment that carpetbaggers and black Republican politicians had. They disavowed it. So you have a lot of former Republican voters, white voters in the South, who kind of cross over paths into the Democratic Party, who they blame for the financial crisis in 1873. So you're starting to see a little bit of a shift. Northern voters and Northern radicals just kind of peel back because they think that they had accomplished their mission. Not quite, but that's how they felt at the time. And then the Panic of 1873 had really put a damper on Reconstruction efforts. And that was really something that caught hold because Republicans in 1873 were blamed for that. So when there were midterm congressional elections in 1874, Democrats gained a whole lot of seats in Congress as sort of a repudiation of Republican policies in the early 1870s that led to that crash, that panic, if you will, of 1873. So, to kind of appeal to Southerners and Southern voters, Ulysses Grant kind of reduced the number of federal troops in the South, which had been there since the end of the Civil War. Okay? You're trying to make a statement. Now you're making a statement kind of going a little bit the other way. So, 1876, there would be a presidential election. And Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican candidate from Ohio, the former governor of Ohio, that is, and the Democrats would nominate Sam Tilden, former governor of New York, who largely had support in New York and in the South. So, the campaign was pretty bitter. And when it came down to election time, they were very, very, very close from a voting standpoint. As a matter of fact, Sam Tilden actually had more popular votes by about 250,000 or so. He had a few more popular votes. But as we know, especially if you've taken Government 2305, it is not the popular vote that elects the president. It's the electoral vote. And with the election, there was actually an equal number. There was actually conflict based upon various different states because votes weren't counted correctly, and there's kind of a problem with how votes were to be counted, and there were disputes in several different states like South Carolina, Oregon, and Florida. So there were about 20 or so electoral votes up for grabs, and whoever grabbed them, they win. So, as you can imagine, there'd be a big political fight. Tilden had more votes, but you can make a case that if these states recount correctly, based upon party lines, Rutherford B. Hayes should be president. So, Democrats and Republicans in Congress got together, and they made an agreement. Rutherford B. Hayes would win the presidential election. Democrats would concede that Hayes would be president under the condition that the federal government would remove troops from the South. So no longer would the federal government be able to enforce congressional policies to truly enforce various different things and make other different improvements into the South and to reintegrate the South. So the compromise of 1877 that puts Rutherford B. Hayes in the White House meant that there would be at least one Southerner in the president's cabinet, giving the South a voice. The South would have patronage over various different areas, and there'd be various different internal improvements, including the building of a railroad that would run from the South all the way through Texas and the Texas Pacific, and all federal troops enforcing federal policy in the South would be removed. Do all those things, Republicans, and us Democrats will let you have your president. Republicans agreed to that. And upon doing so, the Democrats would now basically regain control over the South. The Democrats, who were pro-disenfranchisement, they were pro-inequality. A lot of the Reconstruction movements would now be thrown under question because Democrats would now have control of the South. So the Democrats kind of felt as though they had redeemed the old South. They had regained control. They had basically been able to remove many different Republican economic policies. You're going to regain the South. You're going to re-control the South. Okay. And without federal troops to enforce congressional law, you're going to be able to disenfranchise black voters. You're going to be able to further instill the idea of black codes and black disenfranchisement, black harassment, taking advantage of black sharecroppers. There isn't going to be much oversight. So the idea of white supremacy is now back in the forefront. You kind of invigorate many of these different Klan-type movements, and now there's no limitation. Okay. So the legacy of Reconstruction has a mixed bag. The Compromise of 1877 effectively ends Reconstruction. But Reconstruction has a legacy of producing the 14th and 15th Amendments. So now you've defined citizenship as being anybody born within the United States and those who are naturalized through the formal process. You have also granted suffrage to black men with the 15th Amendment. And you cannot prevent them from voting. Okay? So, because of that, those were major wins for black people. They're now officially Americans, and black men are able to actually vote in the process. Okay. So, those were thought as protecting rights and moving forward black people's rights and movements. Okay? Those were good things. There wasn't a wholesale redistribution of land, but by and large, black people did see their incomes rise during that time. Those are some good things about Reconstruction. The bad thing is that it didn't really bring long-lasting equality. That question of equality really wouldn't be formally addressed until the 1960s. Okay? Otherwise, though, you restore the traditional white ruling class with white supremacist views back into power in the South. And that would dismantle many of the various different freedoms that had been argued and literally fought for decades. So you're kind of taking a step back. White supremacy in the South really gains a foothold. And even though slavery is no longer legal, discrimination will rear its ugly head. and there's little that anybody can do about that. So the idea of racial injustice, which we see to this day, mind you, rears its head. And now it's going to take formal shape in the South as standard. That's the great failure of Reconstruction. So Reconstruction has to be met with a mixed bag. Black people did extend rights, voting, and citizenship, and then they would invisibly have many of those stripped from them by intimidation and other disenfranchisement movements. So, Reconstruction, mixed bag, and it ends with the Compromise of 1877, and the South having been redeemed.